So just for the camera, can you identify yourself and where you?
My name is Jeremy Jackson. I'm a professor of oceanography at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, California.
For people that live in Kansas or people who are not by the ocean, even for people who are by the ocean, why are oceans important?
Oceans are 3/4 of the planet. They're most of the water on the earth. They control the cycles of carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and water that we need to live. They provide us with food. And they're a big part of the global climate and the comfort and the climate we take for granted.
It's a strange question, but as simply as you can state it, what are the ocean fundamentals of how it works?
So that you can think of the ocean like a machine, and the material of the ocean is the water, and it's mostly very deep. Most of the ocean is 10,000 feet deep and even deeper, and the water moves around, and the reason the water moves is because the earth spins on its axis and the wind blows on the surface, and more subtly because water is of different density depending on how salty it is or how hot or cold it is. And so the readjustment of water of different mass or density results in a continual flow of water throughout the entire global ocean. There's even a conveyor belt of flow that starts in the North Atlantic, and it takes more than 1,000 years for water to make all of its way to the northern Pacific and come back up and move around. But it's a heat engine. It's driven by the gravitational forces of the earth moving and the energy from the sun.
Just generally more about the ocean, what is the composition of, if you picked up a cup of seawater and looked at it?
So seawater is 3.5% salt, like ordinary table salt. It wasn't always just that, sodium chloride. In the very beginning of the ocean, maybe 3-4 billion years ago, it was more bicarbonate than chloride. But it's mostly just ordinary common table salt with a lot of other things like potassium and calcium and carbonate in much smaller amounts. And that salt makes it a little denser than fresh water. That's part of why water moves. It's really it's a very simple solution. What makes it complicated is life that adds all sorts of other special properties to water. It's light within the first few hundred feet from the surface, but most of the ocean is pitch black. The only light in deep ocean comes from organisms that make light or from underwater volcanic activity or something like that. So it's a big, dark, cold place. Most of it's barely above freezing. The surface, of course, varies depending on whether it's at the poles or at the equator, something like 85 degrees to nearly freezing or freezing.
And has the composition of seawater changed recently due to pollution in any measurable way?
Well, the composition of seawater has changed a lot due to people, but not really in its fundamental properties. What's striking is that the things we worry about are really things that exist in trace amounts but have huge impacts on the style of life that can live in the ocean. So we worry about very serious consequences, but in fact, seawater is seawater with a little bit of good stuff or a little bit of bad stuff in it. The bulk properties of seawater haven't really changed because of what we've done. It's the fertilizers and the toxics and all of those things that are really more important from a human perspective.
How are the oceans doing? What are the state of the oceans right now?
Well, the oceans are really, from a human perspective, the oceans are a mess right now. From a perspective of bacteria, it's in great shape. Basically, what we've used the ocean for thousands of years is to take out all the good stuff we can get, which is mostly fish and things like fish, and we've used it as a garbage can to get rid of all the stuff we don't want. And so over time, the seemingly bottomless ocean, the seemingly infinite ocean has become drastically depleted in the resources we value, and it's become increasingly polluted by all the junk of humanity and civilization that we want to get rid of. And it's remarkable that we could have an impact to the extent we have on what is 3/4 of the earth, but we're actually getting to the point where we're doing that. So in terms of the things we like, we've virtually eliminated all the large organisms we like to eat. When Columbus sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, there were maybe a dozen species of animals bigger than his largest ship. Sailors had a right to be terrified of sea monsters. There were things bigger than what they sailed in that could sink their boats if they crashed into them. We've done a pretty good job of eliminating virtually all the large animals in the sea. There are still a few tuna and things, but the mere fact that one bluefin tuna in Tokyo is worth $125,000 says something about how rare they've become. People used to throw bluefin tuna away 25 or 30 years ago. We've turned the seafloor into a parking lot by dragging huge trawls across the seafloor. We've mixed species up like mad. Think of analogs to fire ants and kudzu vine in the ocean. We're warming it up, we're poisoning it, and we're over-fertilizing it. And the over-fertilizing is really fascinating because it results in what we call dead zones. But dead zones aren't dead, they're vibrantly alive, but the only thing that lives in them is jellyfish and bacteria. And there's no oxygen except at the surface, and all the shrimp die and the fish die, and these dead zones are bigger than states like New Jersey or Maine. They're just vast. And in 20 or 30 years, we could turn much of the global coastal ocean into one continuous dead zone. It's increasing constantly every year.
What would happen if we did that? Like, the dead zones are obviously not providing oxygen, and
the biggest consequence would be twofold. I mean, one would be food. We talk about farming sea life in the coastal ocean, and in theory that's a good thing if it's done responsibly. But nobody wants to farm corn in a toxic waste dump, and certainly nobody wants to eat oysters or sardines or any other kind of fish that lived in a dead zone. A lot of the small plant cells, the phytoplankton, which are the basic building block of the entire food chain of the ocean, in dead zones, a lot of them are toxic. A lot of them are deadly poisonous. So, you could eat I think I call all this stuff slime. So you could eat a slime burger and it might taste really good. And sometimes it would be okay, and sometimes it would kill you. So it would be like a kind of gastronomic Russian roulette. And the other part of it is that it's just really dangerous. And we see that in California now, that surfers have to get hepatitis shots routinely to surf throughout the entire Southern California bight. And that's nothing. That's just the beginning. I mean, we don't have cholera yet, but there's cholera in lots of places in the Gulf Coast, and you can go on and on. I was at a public event a year ago, and I made up as a sort of a joke to give a sense of the idea of dead zones. I said, imagine a movie called Escape from Malibu, where the only people who lived there were the people who were too poor to move to Montana or Wyoming. And everybody laughed. But then a reporter friend of mine here in LA sent me a photograph of a real Escape from Malibu on the Gulf Coast of Florida, where these big, huge, toxic blooms come into shore, and the water gets stirred up, and the creatures get blown ashore in the air. And in 24 hours, the emergency rooms of all the hospitals fill up with acute asthma cases. People abandon their homes that they paid millions of dollars for. They move inland, the schools close, the shops shut down, and they stay away for weeks until the toxic bloom goes away. So Escape from Malibu is real. It's just a town in Florida beat California. And that's not surprising, because the Gulf of Mexico is in a lot worse shape than the Eastern Pacific. But we'll get there if we don't change. It's very clear. So human health and human food are huge issues about that. The problem, though, is that the reason we have dead zones is because we like to eat. And so it's all the fertilizer that we throw in the ground to make wheat and corn and rice and all of that. So we've made a kind of bargain with the devil, and in order to feed ourselves from the land, we're killing our capacity to feed ourselves from the ocean. And we're going to have to make a choice and figure out how to do that. And that's a huge challenge. That's not easy. Some things are easy, but that's really hard.
And just have you thought about what to do about it?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, you can't feed people without screwing up the environment. I mean, that's been true for as long as there have been people. You just screw it up worse or less. And so, I mean, we're not going to stop feeding the 6 billion and counting people. The good news is we're going to level off at 9 billion people. The bad news is that we don't know how to do that without making dead zones and causing a lot of other problems. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that. We could use a lot less fertilizer. In fact, a lot of the fertilizer we use because we subsidize the use of fertilizer. The fertilizer industry certainly wouldn't like to see us use less fertilizer. We don't really need to use all of that. We don't really need to use all the insecticides. We could get away with a lot less and do just as well, but it's not easy. It's like global warming. We're not going to stop moving around the planet. So we're not going to stop using oil. We can use it smarter or we can use it stupider, but we're still going to use it. So those kinds of, it's not like we can be good and green in 5 minutes, but they're not unsolvable problems. They're in fact quite straightforward. It's a matter of will and priority. And people have to want to do it. Nobody's going to do it by regulation.
And so how do you, I mean, just because we know you know much more besides just about oceans, it's like you travel around and you meet with so many people. What do you think is in us that prevents us from embracing solutions in, the culture at large? What do you think we're facing as a human race?
Well, the reason we're in so much trouble is because we're so smart and so clever. I mean, people are amazing. And every time, I mean, our lives now are so much better than they were 200 years ago. I mean, it wasn't until about 150 years ago that cities weren't places where more people died than were born. The only reason cities like London and New York survived was because they sort of skimmed the cream from the countryside all the time. So we're healthier, we live longer. I mean, our lives are vastly better. And presumably that's a good thing. And it's not that people are evil or even stupid. It's just that we're not very good at anticipating problems until they happen. So the big thing is just really being willing to confront the reality. You can think of civilization as being like a little fortress, and we build a wall, which we call technology, and civilization is inside the wall along with all the good stuff we take from nature, and nature is that thing outside along with the bad stuff that we throw away. And economists actually have a word for the bad stuff. They call it externalities. And they're all the things we didn't pay for progress. But now the externalities are knocking down the wall. And so we're faced with this situation that these things we could ignore are no longer trivial. And it's not a small challenge to adjust to that. And I think there are a lot of people who are trying to think it through. Of course, there are an awful lot of people who are fundamentally corrupt, who don't want to respond, at least not on their watch, because they can benefit greatly by ignoring it. But I think most people are starting to get an idea that we are potentially in a lot of trouble, but they don't have a very good idea of what to do, and we don't have leaders anymore. We have facilitators. So it's going to take some kind of really inspired leadership to help people see that.
How much time do we have, really, do you think, in terms of, and it's really not about so much the Earth as it is us, isn't it? Because you just said the oceans are fine, or you didn't say the oceans are fine.
No, the oceans, from the point of view of life in the oceans, they're a disaster. From the point of view of bacteria, they're great. I mean, we've not managed to cause extinction of many ocean species. So if we wiped ourselves out tomorrow, in a few thousand years, the oceans would probably be very similar to the way they used to be, and do just fine. What we're really talking about is the quality of life of human beings, and what options we'll have and what resources we'll have. I genuinely believe people are not going to cause their own extinction. I think we'll always be there. and we'll slog along. But whether or not our lives will have any quality or beauty or meaning in ways that are traditionally important to us is really up for grabs. And all you have to do is go spend, a few months, not as a tourist, but actually sit there in one of the really big cities in Asia, where there's 25 million people, and people don't eat for days at a time, and most kids die, and all of that kind of stuff, to see just how grim it can be. We've managed to live in the wonderful way we've lived through all those externalities we didn't pay for, and we're going to have to somehow adjust. So when I think of my own kid, and what kind of life are they going to live in, world are they going to live in? They're certainly going to have the opportunity to live to a good old age unless we have some stupid war or something like that. But whether or not they'll have a greater chance of getting cancer, whether or not they will have a greater chance of becoming infected by something because our drinking water stinks, or whether or not they'll have to slog along to make a bare subsistence living or not, these are all things that matter to us. And I don't think we'll really see it until we start to really suffer. But I don't think we're far away from suffering. I think in even within 10 years we're going to start. We've been able to get cheap oil because we are the only people who can afford it, and there are more than 1 billion Chinese, and they're willing to drive up the price to anything it takes to get all the oil they need. So what do we do when gas is $5 a gallon in a year or so, and then it's going to be 10, and then it's going to be 15, and we're not going to be able to drive the way we drove? All of this stuff is going to happen, and we in the United States are the most backward advanced nation in the world about this. We have the worst public transportation. We have the poorest food quality. We spend more than anybody else on medicine, and yet we don't live nearly as long as people in other developed countries. So for us, the learning curve is going to be really, really steep. And for people in places like Japan or Spain, maybe a little less so, because they're a little closer to it.
What's happening in corals, and why is it important?
Well, if you make a list of all the bad things in the ocean that are going on in the ocean, they all are hammering corals. So we take all the big fish out of the ocean, and big fish eat little fish, so that sets off these chain reactions that result in, eventually, as you move down the line, the grazers are gone, the seaweed overgrows and smothers the corals and kills the coral. The trawling and dynamiting for fish, of course, blows up coral reefs, and so that's obviously bad. Introduced species kill corals. Warming is doing a real number on corals because corals are a symbiosis between the animal, the coral that sort of builds the castle, and the little unicellular algae called dinoflagellates that live inside. The corals give the little algae nutrients, and the algae photosynthesize and give the coral sugar. When it gets too warm, they can't make the sugar, and the corals think they're cheating, and they kick out the corals, and they literally starve to death and die if they don't get their little algae back in a few weeks or a month. Imagine, this is a story my wife told me, or a metaphor, think about if you went camping somewhere in the Sierras or something on the 4th of July, and you woke up in the morning and every tree around, or 80% of them, had dropped their leaves. And you were sort of freaked out by that, and you came back here and you turned on the TV and you discovered that in the entire continent of North America, 80% of all the trees had dropped their leaves. And then a month later, you found out that a quarter of those had died. Well, the Indian Ocean is about the same size as North America, and 80% of the corals in the Indian Ocean bleached in the El Nino year of 1998, and a quarter of those died. So that's what happened in the Indian Ocean. Toxics are really bad for corals, and we don't really understand how much they affect corals, but they affect everything else, so they presumably affect reproduction and things like that in corals. And then what I call the rise of slime, the dead zones, the eutrophication of the oceans in the scientific jargon, that since so many of these microbes are toxic. They have an enormous effect on corals. In fact, coral disease, which is one of the major agents of mortality of corals, is essentially another aspect of the rise of slime. And the big three killers of corals today are disease and bleaching and overgrowth by algae because of overfishing. And so all of these are things directly related to us. And people will say, oh, it's the hurricanes. Well, corals dealt with hurricanes for millions of years. They're in such terrible shape now that when a hurricane happens, the reefs just simply don't recover. But it's not the hurricanes that cause that problem. It's us and these other things we do. So corals are in really bad shape. I used to work in Panama, and over the nearly 40 years I've been going there, the people have cut down something like 80% of the forest in Panama, but that's really good news compared to the coral reefs of Panama, most of which are just destroyed. And the live coral cover in Panama and Jamaica and places like that has gone from 50, 60% living coral to 1%, 3%, 5%. And so you go, I taught my son, is 34 years old, I taught him how to snorkel on the 4 reefs of Jamaica when he was 10. I have a picture on my desk of him, the grin on his face when he came out of the water the first time. The reefs were beautiful. There weren't many fish there. A lot of the danger signs were there. We didn't realize it. With 20/20 hindsight, we know why they died, but they hadn't died yet, and we didn't understand it. And my daughter's 20, and when she was 10 years old, I thought about taking her to Jamaica to teach her how to snorkel because there was a nice symmetry to that, and then I realized that there wouldn't be any coral there to see, so I didn't do it. And I was back in Jamaica in December of last year, and things are a tiny bit better than they were 20 years ago, and there may be even 5 or 10% coral cover, but they had a terrible bleaching event, and half of those corals in most of the species were dying while I was there in December. So it's bad news. It's really, really bad, and there's some good signs, and we can see a lot of hope. It turns out that there are algae, these things called zooxanthellae that make the sugar for the corals. There are varieties that are very resistant to high temperature, and we think we see a shift. And if we're right about that, then, in 5,000 years, corals will be fine. But for the next few hundred years, they could be mostly dead reefs. From our perspective, they won't be fine at all. I don't think corals are going to go extinct. I think very few species will go extinct, but coral reefs will go from being the most magnificent and large and diverse ecosystems rimming the tropical oceans of the world to sort of a minor component for a long time because of what we've done to coral reefs. So, have done, over the last 5 years, I've done a lot of historical ecology because, we destroyed so much of what was natural in the oceans long before there were marine biologists. And so it becomes this conundrum. How do you study something that doesn't exist anymore? And you can do it historically, and I've written a lot of papers about this, about the huge numbers of turtles, for example, that were in the Caribbean, that were the equivalent of the bison on the plains of North America 500 years ago. But most people just don't trust history. We're a fundamentally ahistorical society. And so what we all decided was we needed a time machine. We needed to be able to find a place on the planet that, because of being so far away of anywhere that anybody wanted to go, had been forgotten and was somehow sort of intact. And one of those places is the Northern Line Islands in about 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. And the Line Islands are in a line. They extend from south of Hawaii to north of Tahiti. And we went to 4 of them in the north, and the 2 northernmost ones are protected. They're protectorates of the U.S. The 2 southernmost ones are not protected and inhabited by people from a very poor island nation, and there are 10,000 people on the southernmost island, and there are no people on the northernmost island. And we went to the southernmost island, and it was terrible. Most of the coral was dead. It was covered with seaweed. The water was full of bacteria. It was disgusting. There were no fish and whatever. Although, terrifyingly, This place, called in English Christmas Island because it was discovered by Captain Cook on Christmas Day, is in great shape compared to islands in the western part of this same country, the Republic of Kiribati. Tarawa, the capital, is just a garbage heap. And in the northernmost island where there was no people, we jumped in the water and we saw something vaguely like what a coral reef used to look like. There were tons of fish, and 85% of all the fish in the water were top predators. Half of the top predators were sharks, and the other half were enormous jacks and snappers. So the ecological pyramid was literally upside down. And you could not swim anywhere without seeing 25 sharks. The coral was in beautiful shape. There was almost no sign of disease. Things were recruiting. And what's really exciting and important about this is that it doesn't matter how far away you are from people, global warming is everywhere. And these islands where the coral looks so beautiful, it had a really serious bleaching event about 10 years before, and yet they had managed to recover because they were so healthy in all these other ways. And the moral of that story, of course, is that although global warming will always be a problem, it's a lot less of a problem when the reefs are otherwise healthy and then have to deal with only one major problem instead of all three of the big ones at once. And that's been very controversial. And so we think that through this expedition that we made, that is a real sign of hope, that a lot of these things that people have thought were hopeless really aren't hopeless because of the fact that there is this resilience in the ecosystem if you don't kick it while it's down. And this is a lesson that I think the science community has to learn as much as the general community, because if you were to interview 1,000 coral reef scientists, I would wager that not 10 or 20 of them have ever in their careers seen a place like this place in the northern Line Islands. So everything they've studied in their careers has been essentially a wasteland by comparison to what it once was.
It seems like the human species is living in a bit of a delusion because fish seem so plentiful. The sushi shops and
In the United States, fish are plentiful. The reason fish are plentiful in the United States is because we take the fish from everywhere else. Fish are still really cheap in the United States. Sort of low-quality fish stick fish are really cheap in the United States. And farm salmon are really cheap, and a lot of the high-end, white, delicate-tasting fish are still pretty cheap in a Costco. But I think Costco now, the last time I looked, Costco did tell you where most of the fish came from, and most of the fish for sale in a Costco does not come from United States waters. It comes from West Africa, or it comes from the Antarctic Ocean, or the Northern Pacific, or all sorts of places around the world. But the only really successful fishery left in the United States is the Alaskan fishery of things like halibut, and to some extent the less desirable species of tuna in the tropical Eastern Pacific. There's still an awful lot of tuna, although there are a lot less tuna than they used to be. And actually, we're not the worst offenders. The Europeans are even worse than we are. So they will go in and they will buy the fishing rights of West African countries and fish out everything and sell it in Europe and the United States. And of course, to us, $10 or $15 or $20 a pound for good fish is something we can afford. But that might be the monthly wage of a person in the country where that fish came from. So there's a lot of fish still in the United States. There's a lot of fish still in Japan. There's a lot of fish still in Western Europe. But there's not a lot of fish everywhere else in the world. And the total amount of fish that's being caught in the ocean has been declining for 10 or 15 years. And we are very close to the point where half of the fish that we eat in the entire world will be farmed fish. Most of it tilapia, which is a fish that feeds on crud in mud in fresh water. And it's all right. If you make a curry out of it, it's fine.
What do you want to communicate to the world about the oceans right now? And What do we need to know in the simplest, most direct terms?
I mean, people have to have some modicum of understanding of what's going on, and that is really very simple, but the ocean is so unfamiliar to people that it's a challenge. It's pretty easy to convey a crisis in a rainforest. It's pretty easy to convey clear cutting, but it's very hard to convey trawling. So somehow, I very much want to get across the idea that things are really running out and are really on the brink of disaster, and I have struggled with thinking about how to do that. I think in the simplest terms, it's probably enough to say that we're running out of food, that the food we eat from the ocean is becoming more and more dangerous. I tell my daughter, don't eat salmon more than once a month. The government would say that's overreacting. You can do it once a week, but I don't believe it. And I read the scientific papers that describe the amount of mercury and PCBs in the fish. So our food is becoming poisoned to the point that we should worry about it. There's less and less of it. The water, it's becoming more and more unhealthy to just swim in the ocean. And all of these are simple to understand canaries in the coal mine of much more subtle and scary disasters on the horizon. We really could tip the ocean into a different state. The health of the ocean as we know it depends on the water turning over, of the surface water sinking to the bottom and the bottom water coming up to the top. It's conceivable that we could turn that conveyor belt off by warming of the surface of the ocean a little bit too much. And if we do that, with all of our dead zones, we could make the surface, the whole damn surface ocean, stagnant. And that's a terrifying thought. The last time that happened was the end Permian mass extinction, and more than 95% of all the species on the Earth went extinct at the end of the Permian. Do I think that's going to happen? I have no idea. The mere fact that I don't have any idea, that it's not a totally absurd idea, should be scary enough. But I think that's hard for people to understand. So not all of the problems in the ocean are that difficult to understand, and some of them are really actually simple. If you don't kill fish, they live. And if you set aside areas of the ocean in which you don't kill fish, they will increase and multiply, just like national parks on the land. And we call these things marine protected areas, and they work dramatically. They don't necessarily increase the amount of fish we get to eat, but they certainly guarantee that there will be fish left in the ocean, which is certainly an incredibly important insurance policy, and they might even increase the productivity in a big way over the long term. It's amazing how controversial something as simple as underwater national parks. There's an enormous amount of controversy and acrimony about it. In a media project I'm involved in called Shifting Baselines, we made a short, funny public service announcement about a fisherman who is confronted by a fish and game officer who asks him what he caught that day, and he says he got the mother lode, and he holds up a string of toy minnows, and the guy says, I haven't seen fish that big in years. And then we back off and we say, well, not that bad, but there's been a huge decrease in abundance and size of fish, and it's a problem, and these protected areas are solution MPAs, underwater national parks. And it's funny and it's fun, and it got shown all over California, and it got a great response, but it got a hugely negative response from sports fishermen who were deeply offended and angered by this little innocent film. And for me, what that shows is what a polarized society we are, and how self-centered we are as a society, and how unwilling we are to consider giving up even a little thing that we do for fun, or of course for some of those people it's their livelihood too, but that there's just no compromise or discussion. And this is so simple. In all the places that these marine parks have been created, when they're big enough and they're really enforced and they've been there a while, they work. So much so that the Australian government has protected 1/3 of the entire Great Barrier Reef from fishing. And they made that decision just a couple of years ago because they realized that they hadn't been doing enough. And yet, when we tried to protect 5% of the Florida Keys, the uproar was so great that we had to back off. So we have a long way to go in the United States to sort of getting it about the degree of the problem. But in the rest of the world, this idea is really catching on, and it really works. What would I like to say to people 100 years from now? I guess what I'd hope would be true, and I believe it or not, I'm sort of an optimist, that I hope that when they open this, if this time capsule were floating around in the ocean, that they could even find it, that it wasn't hidden in a sea of garbage, and that they'd actually be walking on the beach because that was a nice thing to do instead of a stinky, unhealthy thing to do, and that they had solved all these problems that look so big to us today, but which I hope are solvable.